2,100 warships held position above Zelene Prime, and not one of them fired. The light of the planet's twin moons caught their hulls in long silver bands, row after row of vessels that should not have existed, arranged in concentric rings so precise they looked less like a fleet and more like a diagram of something inevitable. Gun ports dark, shields at standby, engines at station-keeping thrust, and nothing more. From the surface, the Zelene looked up and saw their sky had been replaced. Then the broadcast began. It played on every frequency the Zelene sovereignty used: military, civilian, commercial, emergency. It bled through hardened command channels and children's entertainment bands alike. A human voice, mid-sentence, already breaking. "This is Ambassador Reese. We are under fire. We carry no weapons. Please." The signal cut to static. Then it started again from the beginning. And again. And again. On the bridge of the flagship Crimson Mandate, a junior officer sat at his sensor station with a small golden disc in his clawed hand. It was a diplomatic seal, earth and olive branches etched into its face. He had taken it from the wreckage of a ship he'd helped destroy. He'd kept it at his station for weeks, a souvenir of easy victory. Now the voice of the dead man it belonged to was playing through every speaker on his ship, and the golden disc felt heavier than anything he had ever held. The human fleet hung in the dark above his homeworld, silent, waiting, weapons cold. And somehow that was worse. If you want to know how a civilization, Eli, that spent 200 years conquering every species it touched got brought to its knees by a fleet that refused to shoot, subscribe, because this story is just getting started. The diplomatic seal had still been warm when Kethvos pulled it from the wreckage, 3 standard months before the sky above his homeworld went dark with human ships. He remembered the warmth because it didn't make sense. The hull fragment he'd plucked it from had been frozen, venting atmosphere into open space, and everything else his salvage team recovered was cold enough to crack. But the small golden disc had been warm against his palm, as if the dead ambassador's hand had only just released it. Keth had tucked it into his belt pouch and hadn't mentioned it to anyone. That was 91 days ago. A different war, a different officer, a different color of chitin on his arms. But the seal, he still had the seal. 3 months and 91 days earlier, the galaxy had been a place that made sense to Kethvos. He was 23 in Zelene years. Junior sensor operator aboard the Crimson Mandate, Admiral Sekhar's flagship, assigned to the Sovereignty's second expansion fleet. His chitin was a deep, healthy emerald, the color of a young male with prospects, confidence, and the unshakable belief that the species sitting at the top of 9 conquered worlds would remain there permanently. His species had been conquering for 200 years. 9 civilizations had folded beneath Zelene expansion. The pattern was as reliable as gravity. The Sovereignty identified a weakness, applied force, and the galaxy rearranged itself accordingly. Humans, by all assessments, were not a species that required force. Keth had studied the files. 280 years of successful mediation. That was the number the intelligence briefings kept returning to. Humans had spent nearly 3 centuries building a reputation as the galaxy's preferred negotiators. The species you called when 2 civilizations couldn't stop killing each other long enough to discuss terms. They ran agricultural exchanges, cultural liaison programs, refugee resettlement initiatives. Their diplomatic fleet was the largest in known space, and it carried no weapons. Not hidden weapons. Not classified weapons. No weapons at all. The Zelene Intelligence Ministry had confirmed this 14 times. Keth found it almost endearing. A whole species that had decided the universe was a negotiating table. Emperor Vailthan found it something else entirely. Keth had never been inside the Imperial War Chamber on Zelene Prime, few junior officers had, but everyone on the Crimson Mandate knew what the Emperor thought of humanity's diplomatic obsession. The word Vailthan used most often was Kethzarian, an old Zelene term that translated roughly as the softness before collapse. A species that chose words over weapons was a species that had already decided to die. It simply hadn't realized it yet. When the order came to intercept the human diplomatic fleet in the Cathus Corridor, Kethvos felt nothing unusual. The corridor was a narrow passage between 2 neutron stars, a natural choke point that every species in the region used for transit. The human fleet would be passing through on its way to the annual peace summit. 14 ships, unarmed, carrying 2,300 diplomats, translators, cultural attaches, and one ambassador whose name Keth would not learn until much later. Admiral Sekura's briefing was efficient. Standard interdiction. Disable communications first. The Emperor wants this completed before the summit delegation is reported overdue. Keth Station handled the sensor sweep. 14 contacts, exactly as predicted. No weapon signatures. No shield generators. The ships were running with their transponders active and their hulls unpressurized for combat, because they had never been pressurized for combat. They were transport vessels, conference ships. One of them was broadcasting music on an open channel. The engagement lasted 90 seconds. Keth watched it on his sensor display. 14 green signatures winking out in clusters of 2 and 3 as the Xeline warships fired. The human ships didn't scatter. They couldn't. They had no evasive programming loaded because they had no reason to evade anything. 2 of them attempted to turn, and Keth realized with a small, uncomfortable shift in his thorax that they were trying to shield the others with their hulls. Unarmed ships trying to physically block weapons fire with their bodies. It didn't work. 90 seconds. 14 ships. 2,300 dead. The last transmission came through on an open channel, and because Keth Station handled communications intercept, he was one of the first to hear it. "This is Ambassador Reese. We are under fire. We carry no weapons. Please." The signal ended. Not cut. Ended. The ship carrying the voice simply ceased to exist between one word and the next. Keth Voss logged the transmission, tagged it as a standard final broadcast, and archived it. His chitin was still emerald. His claws were steady. The engagement had been clean, efficient, and exactly what 200 years of Xeline military supremacy looked like when applied correctly. It was only later, after the salvage teams picked through the frozen debris field and Keth found the small golden disc with its engraving of a blue-green world and 2 curved branches, that he felt something he couldn't immediately classify. Not guilt. Not yet. Just a sensation in his lower thorax, near the nerve cluster that processed spatial dissonance. The feeling that something was shaped wrong. He pocketed the seal and returned to his station. 16 hours later, every human signal in the galaxy went dark. Keth noticed it on his sensor board first, a cascade of dropouts spreading across the communication grid like a wound closing. Human commercial frequencies, gone. Diplomatic channels, gone. Agricultural station telemetry, cultural exchange broadcasts, even the music streams that human ships left running on open channels as a courtesy to nearby traffic, all of it everywhere at once. Silence. Not the silence of a defeated species. Keth had monitored 9 conquered civilizations, and he knew what defeat sounded like on a sensor board. It sounded like fragmentation, signals scattering, frequencies doubling over each other in panic, distress calls layering until they became noise. This was the opposite. This was every human voice in the galaxy stopping at the same moment, as if a single hand had closed a single switch. Coordinated. Total. Intentional. And then carried on the last open Terran military frequency before it too went silent. A voice Keth did not recognize spoke 6 words that his translation software processed without difficulty, but that his mind kept circling back to for reasons he could not articulate. My brother's ship was unarmed. He was smiling when they fired. The frequency closed. The silence held. Keth Voss sat at his station, the golden seal warm in his belt pouch, and for the first time in his life, his emerald chitin flickered. The silence lasted 11 days. Keth Voss counted them. Not because anyone ordered him to, Sekura's bridge crew had operational clocks for that, but because counting gave his mind something to grip while the sensor board stayed empty. 11 days of scanning every frequency the Crimson Mandate could reach and finding nothing. No human distress calls. No refugee transmissions. No scattered chatter from merchant ships or colony outposts or any of the thousands of human installations that had been broadcasting constantly for as long as Keth had been alive. The species that had talked more than any other civilization in known space had stopped talking all at once, and the quiet was so total it made Keth's antennae ache. On the 12th day, Admiral Sekura received a summons to the Imperial War Chamber on Xeline Prime, and because the Crimson Mandate was Sekira's flagship, the entire vessel made the jump. Keth had never been to the homeworld's capital complex. When the shuttle descended through the atmosphere and the war chamber came into view, a structure carved from a single piece of volcanic glass, rising 900 meters above the palace district like a fawn. His chitin brightened to its deepest emerald. Pride. Awe. The automatic response of a young Zelene male in the presence of imperial power. The war chamber's interior was worse. Better. Keth couldn't decide. Holographic star maps covered every wall, floor to vaulted ceiling, so that walking into the room felt like stepping into the galaxy itself. Stars drifted at waist height, nebulae curled around the support columns. And at the center, on a raised platform that put him level with the spiral arm containing Earth's sun, Emperor Vaelthan held court. Keth had seen images. Images were insufficient. Vaelthan was enormous. Half again the height of any Zelene in the room, with 6 arms that moved independently of each other in patterns that seemed to carry meaning Keth couldn't parse. His chitin was not one color. It shifted across his body in waves of deep violet and burning gold, a display that in Zelene biology signaled absolute dominance. No other male in the sovereignty could produce that pattern. Those who had tried had been killed, and their chitin mounted on the chamber walls alongside the ceremonial crests of 9 conquered species. 9 species in 200 years. The trophies ran the full length of the eastern wall. Now, on a small stand near Vaelthan's platform, a new addition. Fragments of a human diplomatic vessel's hull, still scorched, arranged like art. 340 ships, Admiral Sekira reported, standing at the base of the platform with her scarred forelimbs locked behind her back. The scars were old campaigns Keth had only studied in training. Sekira had fought in 6 of the 9 conquests. Her chitin was a permanent dull bronze, the color of someone who had stopped feeling the need to signal anything at all. Mostly patrol class, light armament. Their military doctrine appears to be entirely defensive. Appears. Vaelthan's voice resonated through the chamber, amplified by the architecture. 2 of his 6 arms gestured dismissively. Their military doctrine is non-existent, Admiral. They are merchants and peacekeepers. Without their diplomats, they have nothing. Keth stood at the edge of the room with 40 other junior officers, close enough to hear, far enough to be invisible. He watched Vaelthan's upper arms spread wide, a Zelene gesture of territorial claim, and the holographic stars shifted to center on human-controlled space. It looked small. 12 core systems, a scattering of colony worlds, trade routes that threaded through other species' territory like borrowed roads. The occupation force will deploy in 3 waves, Vaelthan continued. I want human colonies administered before their silence becomes a diplomatic incident. The galaxy will accept this as stabilization. It was then that Counselor Drith Mavani spoke. Keth had not noticed the old diplomat standing near the eastern wall. Drith was ancient by Zelene standards, thorax plates cracked and faded to the pale gray blue of advanced age, for of 6 arms trembling with a slight palsy that made every gesture look like it was being performed underwater. Drith had served on joint committees with humans for 30 years, the longest continuous diplomatic posting in sovereignty history. Most of the court considered the appointment a polite exile. Drith's views on interspecies cooperation were well known and widely ignored. Your Eminence. Drith's voice was thin but carried the particular clarity of someone who had stopped caring about the consequences of being heard. I must formally advise against this course. Vaelthan's chitin pulsed once. Amusement, Keth thought. Noted, Counselor. Your objection will be archived. It should be more than archived. Drith took 2 steps forward, and the holographic stars passed through the old diplomat's translucent chitin plates like light through cracked glass. I have worked with humans for 3 decades. They are not what this court believes them to be. You do not understand what you have provoked. The war chamber went still. 40 junior officers stopped breathing. Sekira's scarred forelimbs tightened behind her back. Vaelthan leaned forward on his platform. All 6 arms went motionless, the most dangerous signal in Zelene body language. Total focus. What I have provoked, Counselor, is the removal of an obstacle. The humans talked for 280 years. Now they are silent. Silence is the natural state of the conquered. Drith Mavani stared up at the Emperor for a long moment. Then the old counselor's chitin did something Keth had never seen before. It shifted to pure white. Not age-pale. Not faded. White. The color of grief in a species that did not grieve easily. Then this court will learn, Drith said quietly, what the silence of humans actually means. Vailthan waved a dismissal with his lowest left arm. Drith turned and walked out of the war chamber without waiting for formal leave. No one stopped the counselor. No one followed. Keth Voss logged the exchange in his personal notes that evening, not because he was required to, but because the white chitin had unsettled him in a way he didn't have vocabulary for. He wrote, Counselor Drith warned the Emperor. The Emperor was not concerned. I am recording this because I think one of them is wrong, and I do not know which one. He would know soon enough. If you've ever wondered what it sounds like when an empire realizes it miscounted, subscribe and stay close. The numbers are about to change. The weeks that followed were, by every external measure, a triumph for the Zilene sovereignty. Trade Minister Aurelice of the Vanthari Mercantile Union, a species that valued commerce the way Zilene valued conquest, severed all trade agreements with human systems on the first day of the silence. Keth read the official statement on his data feed during a meal break. The Vanthari Mercantile Union considers the Terran Federation diplomatically non-viable and hereby suspends all commercial treaties pending resolution of current hostilities. 47 trade routes closed overnight. The galaxy was already dividing the corpse. The Machine Collective, an AI consortium that provided actuarial analysis for interstellar insurance markets, published its survival probability assessment on day 19. Keth pulled it up on his sensor station because the number was circulating through the crew like a joke. 4.1%. The machines gave humanity a 4.1% chance of surviving as a sovereign entity. The crew of the Crimson Mandate found this generous. Keth found it funny too. He polished the diplomatic seal at his station while he read the report, running his claw tip along the engraved olive branches. The golden disc had become a habit, something to fidget with during long shifts. Other officers had their own trophies from the diplomatic fleet debris. Sekera had said nothing about it. Spoils of engagement were traditional, but somewhere around day 30, the seal stopped feeling like a trophy. Keth couldn't pinpoint when it changed. The object was the same weight, same warmth that never quite faded, same engraving of that small blue-green world. But his hands started turning it over more slowly. He started looking at the olive branches and wondering what they were. He started noticing that the engraving was precise in a way that suggested someone had cared about getting it right. Not the precision of military manufacturing, but the precision of meaning. He put it in his belt pouch instead of leaving it on his console. He didn't want the others to see him holding it anymore. On day 41, the Crimson Mandate received an intelligence update that Keth processed as part of his routine sensor duties. It was flagged Priority 7, significant but not urgent. A deep-range scan had identified unusual energy signatures in the outer boundary of human-controlled space, specifically in the Kuiper belt of their home system, specifically inside a moon. Keth read the analysis twice, then a third time. The moon had been classified in galactic surveys as a mineral extraction site, unremarkable, uninhabited, one of several dozen small bodies that humans used for raw material processing. But the energy signatures weren't consistent with mining. They were consistent with manufacturing. Large-scale manufacturing. The thermal bloom alone suggested production lines running 40 kilometers in length. The intelligence addendum noted that similar energy signatures had been detected at 6 other locations across human territory. All had been previously classified as agricultural exchange stations, scientific outposts, or civilian infrastructure. Keth flagged the report for Admiral Sekera's review and returned to his scanning rotation. His chitin had not yet changed from emerald, but his lower thorax, the nerve cluster that processed spatial dissonance, had begun to hum again. The same frequency as the day he'd found the seal. The shape of something wrong. What Keth could not see, what no Zilene sensor station could see, was the woman who read his flagged report's counterpart from the other side. Director Priya Menon did not appear in any Zilene intelligence file. She held no military rank. She attended no summits. For 22 years, she had run the Terran Federation's agricultural exchange program, and every quarterly report she filed showed crop yield data, soil analysis figures, and cultural liaison deployment schedules. The reports were meticulous, boring, and entirely fictional. Forge 7, the facility inside the Kuiper Belt moon that Keth's sensors had just barely detected, was the largest of 7 hidden shipyards that Menon's division had been operating for 4 decades. 40 years of warship production, hidden inside the infrastructure of a species the galaxy had decided was harmless. Every agricultural station, every cultural exchange outpost, every boring quarterly report. All of it had been a shell, and inside the shell, something with teeth had been growing very quietly for a very long time. Menon's report to Admiral Okafor was 3 sentences. Fleet strength as of this morning, 2,100 combat vessels. Full readiness in 72 hours. Awaiting your order. Okafor read it in his quarters aboard the TFS Resolute, in the same chair where he'd watched his brother's last transmission. The small screen was dark now. He'd watched the message 41 times and then stopped, because 41 was the number of years David had been alive, and that felt like enough. He opened a channel to Menon. Director Menon, show them what the agricultural stations actually produce. Somewhere in the outer dark, inside moons and behind the facades of grain processing facilities, and within the hollowed infrastructure of a species the galaxy had written off at 4.1%, 2,100 warships began to move. And Keth Voss, sitting at his sensor station aboard the Crimson Mandate, watched his board light up with contacts that had not existed 30 seconds ago, in numbers that made his translation software request a recalibration, and felt his chitin flicker from emerald to something he had no name for. The Battle of the Cathus Corridor lasted 6 minutes. Keth Voss knew the number because his station clock was the one thing still functioning correctly when it ended. Everything else, threat displays, shield monitors, the tactical overlay that was supposed to track friendly and hostile contacts in 3 dimensions, had devolved into a cascade of error states that his training had not prepared him to interpret. Not because the systems were damaged, because they could not process what was happening fast enough to display it. 18 human ships came through the corridor. The same narrow passage between 2 neutron stars where 90 seconds had erased 14 unarmed vessels 3 months earlier. Sekera had positioned 74 warships at the mouth, a standard interdiction screen, the same formation that had worked flawlessly the first time. The human ships did not slow down. They hit the Zelene formation at an angle that shouldn't have been survivable, threading the gravitational shear between the 2 neutron stars so close that Keth's radiation alarm screamed before a single weapon fired. And then they fired, and the screaming stopped matching. Every shot landed. Not most shots. Not a statistically impressive percentage. Every shot. Keth watched Zelene warships execute evasive patterns. Standard maneuvers, classified maneuvers, maneuvers that had never been countered in 200 years of conquest, and the human weapons were already waiting where the ships arrived. Predictive targeting so precise it looked like prophecy. As if the humans had run this battle 1,000 times in simulation and were now just confirming the results. The smell hit Keth before the fear did. Ozone and scorched circuitry flooding through the Crimson Mandate's ventilation as near misses superheated the outer hull. The bridge reeked of burning metal and something sharper underneath. Stress pheromones, pouring off every officer in the room. A chemical signature that Zelene biology produced involuntarily when the body recognized a predator. Keth had never smelled it on a warship before. He'd never had reason to. Sekera stood at her command platform, scarred forelimbs locked on the tactical rail, watching her fleet come apart. She did not give the order to retreat. There was nowhere to retreat to. The corridor was a choke point, and the humans had sealed both ends in the first 40 seconds. It was during the 3rd minute, with 11 Zelene ships already gone and the Crimson Mandate shuddering from a glancing hit that carved a trench along the port hull, that Keth's communications intercept picked up a human transmission on an open channel. Unencrypted. Casual. Admiral, engagement proceeding 11 seconds ahead of schedule. Coffee's ready in the wardroom whenever you're finished. Keth stared at the translation. Read it again. A 3rd time. Around him, officers were dying. The ship 2 positions starboard of the Crimson Mandate had just broken in half. Alarms layered over each other until they became a single sustained tone. And the humans were talking about coffee, about being ahead of schedule, as though the destruction of 74 warships by 18, was a task between tasks. Something to finish before a beverage cooled. 6 minutes. 18 human ships. 74 Xeline warships reduced to expanding clouds of debris and rescue beacons that no one was coming to answer. The Crimson Mandate survived because Sekira ordered a full stop and cut all weapon systems before the 4th minute ended. Surrender posture. The most humiliating signal a Xeline warship could broadcast. The humans accepted it without comment and moved on. Keth sat at his dead console, the golden seal pressing against his hip through the belt pouch, and breathed air that tasted like a funeral. The court fractured within days. Keth learned the details the way junior officers always learn things, through fragments overheard in corridors, through status reports that circulated one clearance level above his own, through the involuntary kite and shifts of senior staff who forgot that their colors told stories their mouths wouldn't. Counselor Drith Mavani returned to the Imperial War Chamber for the last time on the 6th day after the battle. Keth was not present, but the recording circulated through every ship in the fleet within hours, because Vailthan wanted it to. The old diplomat stood before the Emperor, white-chitined, trembling, for arms barely functional, and said, for the official record, what had already been said in private. I warned you, they are not what you think. Vailthan executed Drith in the war chamber. Keth watched the recording on a secondary screen at his sensor station, alone, during a shift change when the bridge was empty. The Emperor used his own forelimbs. It took less than a second, Vailthan's upper arms moving with the mechanical speed of a species built for killing, and Drith Mavani, who had spent 30 years trying to explain humanity to a civilization that did not want to listen, ceased to exist as quietly as a signal going dark. Keth closed the recording. His chitin had shifted from emerald to yellow sometime during the playback, and he hadn't noticed. Yellow. Anxiety. The color of a young Xeline who had begun to understand that the shape of his world was not the shape he'd been promised. He took the diplomatic seal from his belt pouch and held it under the console light. Earth and olive branches. The symbol of a species that had spent 280 years offering peace and had been building warships inside moons the entire time. He put it back. His claws were shaking. The reassessment came from Admiral Sekira's intelligence team, and when Keth processed the report through his station, the numbers made his antennae flatten against his skull. Forge 7. The facility inside the human moon. Not a mining operation. A shipyard. Production lines running 40 kilometers through hollowed rock. Building warships that appeared in no database, no survey, no intelligence file. And Forge 7 was one of 7. 7 hidden facilities, 40 years of construction, 2,100 combat vessels that the galaxy's most comprehensive intelligence apparatus had classified as grain silos and cultural exchange centers. Sekira summoned her senior staff. Keth was not senior staff, but his station shared a wall with the briefing room, and Xeline architecture was not built for acoustic privacy. He heard Sekira's voice, stripped of every diplomatic modulation, reduced to the raw frequency of a career officer confronting the unthinkable. They've been building warships inside moons for 40 years, and then a junior analyst, Keth recognized the voice, a female named Taith from the Signals Division, asked the question that no one else would. Why would a peaceful species build 2,000 warships? Sekira's answer carried through the wall with the weight of chitin cracking. Because they weren't peaceful. They were patient. The human fleet arrived at Xeline Prime on a morning when both moons were visible, pale arcs of reflected light hanging above a world that had never been threatened from orbit in its entire history. 2,100 ships. They filled Keth's sensor board from edge to edge, and when he expanded the range, they filled it again. Concentric rings of vessels arranged with the same precision as their targeting, geometric, deliberate, every ship positioned as if the formation itself was a message. Keth waited for the weapon signatures to bloom, for shields to cycle to attack frequency, for the bombardment that 200 years of Xeline military doctrine said was the natural conclusion of orbital supremacy. The weapons stayed cold. Instead, every speaker on the Crimson Mandate, every channel, every frequency, every emergency band began to play a dead man's voice. This is Ambassador Reese. We are under fire. We carry no weapons. Please. And now Keth was back in that moment. The moment from the beginning, the golden seal in his clawed hand, the dead ambassador's voice cycling through the ship, but everything between then and now had been carved into his understanding like a trench cut by neutron star gravity. The broadcast didn't stop with Rhys's voice. It shifted. Footage began streaming on every Xeline visual display, the diplomatic fleet attack from angles Keth hadn't known existed. External hull cameras from the human ships, capturing their own destruction. Faces visible through viewports. A woman clutching documents to her chest. A man reaching for a communications panel that was already melting. Ambassador Rhys, in the final frame before his ship disintegrated, looking directly at the camera with an expression that Keth's threat assessment training could not classify because it was not a threat. It was forgiveness. Then the footage changed. Human rescue workers, from the battles that had already been fought, treating Xeline prisoners. Setting broken chitin. Administering pain suppressants that had been specifically formulated for Xeline biology. A human medic, hands covered in Xeline blood, adjusting a splint on an officer who had been trying to kill her species 6 hours earlier. Xeline Prime's civilian communication networks lit up. Keth could see them on his board. Millions of signals cascading across the planet's surface as the population watched what their emperor had started and what the humans had chosen not to finish. 17 colony worlds transmitted surrender before Vailthan could issue a single order. Then Vailthan issued his order anyway. Use the civilian population centers as shield positions. Reposition the home fleet behind orbital habitats. They will not fire on our people. Keth heard it come through the command channel. Heard the specific theatrical confidence in the Emperor's voice. The same voice that had dismissed Drith, that had called humanity soft, that had displayed wreckage as art. The channel was silent for 4 seconds. Then Sekira's voice, the scarred bronze admiral who had fought in 6 conquests and never once broadcast a surrender posture until 18 human ships made her, Sekira spoke. I will not murder our own people to protect your throne. The command channel erupted. Loyalist officers shouting codes and countercodes. Somewhere on Xeline Prime, palace guards were moving. And on the Crimson Mandate's bridge, Admiral Sekira turned to her communications officer and said, in a voice that carried no more emotion than a status report, open a direct channel to the human flagship. Admiral Okafor, if he is available. Keth watched his own hands enter the frequency codes. His chitin was ash gray, the color of everything after certainty. Okafor's voice came through clean. No static. No distortion. The voice of a man who had waited 3 months for this call and had never once doubted it would come. Admiral Sekira. Admiral, the Emperor has been detained. I am requesting terms. Unconditional military surrender. War Crimes Tribunal for your Emperor. Civilian protection guaranteed by both sides. Sekira's scarred forelimbs gripped the tactical rail. You could destroy us. Your fleet outnumbers ours 6 to 1. Your weapons are... She stopped. Recalibrated. Why offer terms? The channel held silence for a moment. Just a breath. The length of time it takes to touch a golden seal in a pocket and remember whose hand held it last. Because my brother would have. Sekira closed her eyes, all 4 of them, in sequence, the way Xeline did when processing information too large for language. Then she opened them. Accepted. And then Okafor's voice shifted. Not softer. Not harder. Something else, the register of a man speaking to a room larger than the one he was in. The channel was still open. Every frequency. Every species monitoring the surrender. Trade Minister Oral Lease. Members of the Vanthari Mercantile Union. Representatives of every government that severed ties with the Terran Federation 91 days ago. A pause. The kind that let light in. The Terran Federation is willing to resume relations with species that remember the cost of attacking peace. Keth Voss sat at his station on a defeated flagship above a surrendered homeworld, holding a dead man's seal in ash-gray claws, and understood. Finally, completely, the way a bone understands the break. What Counselor Drith had tried to tell them. The humans had never been peaceful. They had been offering peace. And there was a difference so vast that 9 conquered species and 200 years of empire had not been enough to teach the Xeline what it meant. The trial was held at a neutral station 4 months later. Keth testified. He brought the seal, carried it to the witness platform in both hands, the way his species carried objects of ceremonial weight. He described the attack, the 90 seconds, the silence afterward, the coffee comment during the battle, the footage of human medics treating Zelene wounded. And when the tribunal asked why he had kept the seal for so long, Kethvos, chitin still ash-gray, still carrying the color of everything he'd learned, set it on the evidence table and said, "I took this as a trophy. I return it as an apology." Vailthan was convicted. His sentence, to witness in person the reconstruction of every world his campaigns had damaged. To watch what building looked like, since he had only ever understood destruction. The Emperor's chitin, for the first time in recorded Zelene history, showed no color at all. 3 years later, Kethvos returned to the Cathis corridor. The neutron stars were the same, twin gravity wells spinning their endless rotation, bending light into ribbons that made the eye unsure of distance and direction. But between them, where frozen wreckage had once drifted in silence, a station hung in the dark, new, clean, its atmospheric processors so fresh that the air inside tasted faintly of mineral coolant and something Keth's senses read as almost sweet, the chemical signature of construction materials that hadn't yet absorbed the scent of the people who would fill them. The Reese Memorial. They had named it for the dead ambassador. Keth had known they would. He had also known, though no one told him directly, that they would mount the seal at the center of the main hall. He had carried it himself to the tribunal evidence table. He had placed it in human hands and said what he needed to say and walked away with claws that did not shake for the first time in months. Now it was here, set into a column of polished alloy at the exact center of the hall. A small golden disc with a blue-green world and 2 olive branches that Keth finally understood were not decorative. They were an offer. They had always been an offer. Below the seal, an inscription in 17 languages, one for each colony world that had surrendered before a single shot was fired at Zelene Prime. He offered an open hand. They chose war. We chose to finish it. Keth read it in his own language first, then in the human standard script he had taught himself during the reconstruction. The words were the same in both. The weight was different. In Zelene, chose carried a connotation of deliberation, a decision made after all options were considered. In human standard, it was simpler, blunter, a door that opened one way. Trade Minister Oralise was somewhere in the crowd. Keth had caught a glimpse of Vanthari robes near the far entrance, moving with the particular hunch of a species that had come to renegotiate and discovered there was nothing left to negotiate from. The Vanthari had cut their trade agreements on day 1. Now, 3 years later, they arrived with open ledgers and closed mouths, and Keth thought that was probably the most honest thing they had ever done. Admiral Okafor was already at the memorial window when Keth found a place to stand along the observation rail. The human was 57 now, and the 3 years between the war and this moment had settled into his face as a kind of stillness that Keth recognized. Not peace, not grief, something past both. The expression of a person who had finished carrying something and set it down and was now looking at what lay beyond it. Through the window, the new diplomatic fleet was launching. 12 ships, bright-hulled and smooth, moving in formation toward the corridor's exit. And behind them, flanking, unhurried, close enough to be a statement, 4 warships with gun ports visible and running lights on. Diplomacy, escorted this time. An open hand, backed by everything it had cost to learn that open hands needed backing. Keth watched the ships shrink against the stars. His chitin had grown back, over the months, from ash-gray to a color he didn't have a Zelene word for. Not emerald. Not the young confidence of a junior officer who believed the galaxy made sense. Something quieter, harder, closer to the bronze of Admiral Sekara's scarred plates. The color of someone who had seen what the universe actually cost and chosen to stay in it anyway. The light from the twin neutron stars caught the diplomatic fleet's hulls as they cleared the corridor. And for a moment brief, silent, unrepeatable, each ship burned white gold against the dark. Bright as a seal pressed into the hand of a galaxy that was only now learning how to hold it. If that seal could speak, what do you think it would say? To the ones who broke it or to the ones who brought it home? Subscribe and stay for tomorrow's story. Some debts take longer than 3 years to settle.